Hey class, welcome back to week 3 of Drawing 1. Today we're going to work on something that I think is just really fun and is one of the things you're going to use this week, of course, for your project. And this is called subtractive method, tonal drawing in charcoal. So what you're seeing on your screen right now is my paper. I've got one pass of vine charcoal on it, and I'm about to do the second now. You need at least 2 coats when you're working in this method to get a good smooth gradient. I'm actually going to turn my music up for a minute, but I might turn it on again later. In order to get a nice smooth gray to work on, you need at least 2 coats of this charcoal, and I'm just taking the side of my vine charcoal and scribbling it across the surface. You want to be sure and use vine charcoal, not your compressed or softer stuff. Vine charcoal is basically just burnt wood. It's hardwood that's been fired in a kiln so that no oxygen is allowed into the surface, so that it doesn't ever actually burst into flames, and it just chars the wood. So it's a really simple, very soft drawing material, and it erases quite well. That's why you want to use it for this project instead of your harder stuff like compressed charcoal, which is very dark and won't work very well for this method. So now I'm taking a rag. This is just the cotton t-shirt that I cut up. You can use a paper towel, or you can cut up your own t-shirt. And I'm just kind of lightly giving a rub in kind of circular patterns, and you can see it's getting a pretty nicely toned gradient. A couple of things about today's live stream. I've noticed a little bit of a lag in one of the videos that I'm using. I haven't been able to quite work out the kinks on that, so my apologies. My expertise is in drawing and painting, not in videography. Hope you'll forgive that. So, the materials that I'm going to be drawing with today are primarily vine charcoal. I have a couple kinds that I really like, Bob's Fine Vine Charcoal and just a regular Blick. And then I also have some gray kneaded erasers that I'll be using. And I also have a white eraser and a pink pearl. All very useful things to have today. My still life, the photograph that you see on the screen is an approximation of what I'm seeing with my eyes. It's right over here. I'm actually going to be drawing from the still life, not from the photo. So what I draw here might be a little different, but you can also see that because my camera is at a weird angle, we're not square to my paper anyway. So anything that's down here is going to look too small to you, and anything up here is probably going to look too big. Enough caveats. Time to get drawing. Why do I have you work in this method? Why do we gray out the paper? Why do we get rid of all the white? The main reason is because anytime that I have a student who's struggling with drawing what they call realistically, or getting a lot of tonal variety in their work, a lot of times it's because the white of the paper is just beating them up. It's so white that everything that they're looking at is kind of blown out because of it. And so when I look over at that still life, when you guys look in the photograph at the bottom, you might ask yourself, let me ask you, what's the lightest thing in that entire image? Is it the light side of the triangle? Is it the top of the table? Is it the top of the beaver skull? Or is it the reflections of our light sources inside the objects? So I think it's the reflections, which we call highlights, and those highlights are the brightest thing. Now, if I'm drawing on white paper, that's the only thing I could use white paper for, is those highlights. Technically, everything else would need to be some version darker than white paper in order for it to be to make sense in our retina and in the way that we're looking at it. So graying out the paper takes care of that problem at the start, because it means that now I don't have a white surface, I have a gray surface, and I can work back into it with my black and pull back out from it with my light. And between those two methods, I can pull a lot of variety in tonal value and a lot of contrast because I'm using charcoal as I work. Now, let's talk charcoal for just a second. I mentioned before that I'm using vine charcoal. There's 2 main ways to hold a piece of charcoal. The first one is the way that you always are probably most commonly using it, like a drawing method, like a pencil grip. Okay, that's not how I hold my charcoal most of the time. I usually hold mine with what's called an overhand grip, like this. And this allows me to have a slightly different control with the surface and kind of draw with my arm and my shoulder instead of my wrist. And it allows for bigger movements. I'm drawing on a big sheet of paper, so should you this week, and so that'll help. You can see that I taped off the edges of my paper. That's before I put a gradient, so it'll make this really nice, sexy white border when I peel that tape off later. The tape that I use is called artist tape. It's like masking tape, but it's a little less sticky, so it doesn't tear the paper quite as often. It still sometimes does, so you gotta be cautious. So right now, I'm just starting to block in some of my shapes, thinking about the overall size and shape of my forms. One of the things that I asked you to do in your week 3 assignment, which you can find on Canvas, is to think a little bit about your objects. You're supposed to pick at least 2 objects that could be considered focal point objects, 2 objects that are exciting visually and that maybe mean something to you, or have some kind of personal reason for you picking them. My objects that I chose were a beaver skull, and the enclosing glass kind of menagerie case, this kind of bell jar, and then the water pitcher that I used to water my plants with, which I just think looks really cool. Both of them are basically I picked because I think they look cool. Now, a couple things about the way that I'm laying this in right now. Nothing, you'll remember that I've talked before, I'll say it again, you want to draw from the general to the specific. So at this point, nothing is sacred, okay? I'm willing to totally change anything that's happening in here, and I'm going to step back from time to time and get a look at it, make sure to check my proportions, see what I'm getting as I start to work. You'll want to do the same thing. As you draw, kind of from time to time, take a step back from your work and make things happen from a distance where you can see your proportions. So you might have noticed that I screwed up there. When you're drawing with charcoal, a couple things about making a straight line. Number one, you can use the tip of the charcoal, and of course you can make your straight line that way. But the problem is the variation that you might put into the tip is going to create a lot of movement in your line. So if you want a really straight line, you can use the side of the charcoal itself. Just press the whole charcoal to the paper like this, and you can draw a straight line basically every time. And so just a couple little tips like that I'll throw out about charcoal as I work. If you make a mistake while laying in your values and your tones, you can just wipe it off in this gradient method, right? You can just erase something by adding, essentially, by adding charcoal back into the surface. So right now, all I want to do is just kind of get my shapes in the right place, think my way through it, double check my proportions. This can be a time when I do a measurement if I need to. I kind of blocked in that this whole picture right here, if I double it, is about the same size as all the way up to the top of this bell jar. I knew I didn't want that to break the plane, the upward plane of my drawing, so that I could see what's happening. By the way, your drawing paper can be oriented either horizontal or vertical depending on what's better for your composition in your own drawing, okay? So you don't have to do it the way that I'm doing it. You can, when you're like kind of rubbing and working it, you can either work with your fingers, you'll see me do that, or you can use your soft cloth or paper towel, or you can use a chamois. I had you guys buy a chamois cloth. These pull off a much lighter amount. They kind of make a lighter marking when you pull them off. So either way, all that still works really nicely. So here at the start, really what I want to do is I just want to look at big areas of light and dark. I deliberately chose 2 objects that I thought that you might struggle with. A clear object, something transparent in the jar, and then something really reflective in the pitcher. And so in both cases, there's not really, a lot of times I'll have students who'll ask me, like, how do I draw something transparent? And what they mean is, like, what's the trick? Like, how do you make everything look transparent just automatically? And the answer is there isn't really a trick. You have to actually look at the values in front of you, and you try and look for shapes of value rather than objects. Shapes are much easier to draw than objects, and this is something that I talked about last week as well. So what I'm looking at right now in these reflections is I'm looking at the big shapes of dark that are balancing inside those forms in the main cylinders of the top and bottom. And here at this stage, the drawing should and does look pretty crappy, right? I'm just kind of blocking things in, and I will do a lot of refining as I go. Once I get enough dark in enough places, I will do some of the fun spots of pulling out some of the light on the skull and other little areas that I'm excited about. One of the things I like about drawing this way is that it really lets me kind of work, and I hope that you can kind of see what I mean by general to the specific. Here, I'm letting negative space do some of the work. I'm letting value do a lot of the work. And I'm just kind of bouncing around the drawing. Nothing means more than anything else at this stage. And I'm really just trying to think about, like, where are my shapes? How are my shapes looking? I'm using my finger there to pull out a little bit of light for the side of the pyramid, just as a kind of marker. And you can start to see how my light and dark areas will work as I draw. Now, back to the idea of transparency. One way that will help you make transparency appear transparent is to drag an object or a value that is outside the transparent surface, the bottle or what have you, drag it inside that surface, and then let it bend, let it be seen on both sides of that surface. And it'll immediately confirm to your viewer that what they're seeing is translucent, can be seen through. A lot of times I'll see students try and get away with basically just drawing their transparent bottle or jar or piece of glass or whatever, just drawing it with an eraser, so that like all the lines that should be dark are now light, and just letting that be enough. And that's not enough. That's not going to do it. You have to get in there and you have to pay attention to where you're seeing light and reflection and shadow, and then you'll get a lot of surface bounce back into it that you can work with. Okay, so hopefully you can kind of start to see where I'm going with that. And I'm going to grab my eraser, grab the gray kneaded eraser, and I want to pull out some of the light areas that are going to be really important to this drawing. Now, one of the ways that I'm going to be able to see this a little bit better is to squint my eyes. If you're nearsighted like me and wear glasses, you can also look over the top of your glasses and kind of just, the point is you want things to be a little bit blurry, a little bit out of focus, so that you aren't paying so much attention to these tiny little minute details, and instead are working on big shapes of value. What is really light, what's really dark, and what's something in between. And then trying to hunt down those methods as you go, those little spaces inside there. So I've got the gray eraser, and I am kind of squishing it into the shape that I want. And then I'm using that to pull out some of the space and really get a little bit of dimensionality onto the skull here. I think you guys are going to have fun with this project. It's one of my favorite things to teach, because I usually see students go, wow, I didn't know I could make that good looking of a drawing when they start working this way. And I want you guys to have fun with that and realize just how dimensional, how much depth you can get in your forms just by making sure that you have enough lights and darks across them. So you can see I'm kind of working in about 4 different values. There's the original gray, there's the darker tone, then there's a light tone with the eraser and a less light tone with my finger. And I'm kind of trying to bounce between those 4-ish values and get some of the detail started to work in that space. And I don't want to overly do the detail yet because I'll have plenty of time for that. I'm just trying to block things in, see enough forms to make the shapes make enough sense. And I'll have to decide some things right now, like where does the tip of this triangle, this pyramid, how close does it get to the jaw of the beaver? Because they can't. I don't want them to overlap in my vision, in my drawing. So I have to decide exactly where they are now, and then I'll probably have to set that in and live with it the rest of the drawing. So this is again why it's important to work from the general to the specific, so that you can have some room to make those kinds of decisions. Just pull out a few highlights there. So now I want to look for some of my darkest areas and block them in as well. One thing I really like about this is that I'm able to draw on both sides of an object. I feel like too often when I'm working on a white sheet of paper, like when I'm doing comic book illustration or something like that, I'm really forced to kind of draw and shade within the lines, and I'm kind of stuck with, like, I don't want to mess things up, I don't want to mess up the white paper, and so I wind up doing all this work to like try and keep things where I can see them and like everything very clean. And I like that in this method I don't have to be as clean. I can think about almost more like painting. I can work on both sides of a form. So I can work on the positive shape of the skull and the negative shape of the wall behind the skull at the same time. And that's very useful. And freeing. It lets me kind of make decisions that I wouldn't be able to make if I was trying to block everything out and be super careful not to screw up my white paper. So I suspect that you're going to find moments of this very satisfying, very fun, and other moments probably pretty frustrating. Charcoal can be a frustrating medium because it's messy, gets on everything. I usually wear dark clothes, but I'm definitely wearing dark clothes today, so that as I get charcoal on myself, it's not a big deal. I'm drawing on an easel here. You might not have an easel at home. But you can just put your drawing pad or your drawing board in your lap. I wrote in the comments section, or in the subject, the description under the video, the materials I'm using today. But I'm using a Strathmore 300 series smooth Bristol paper, which is quite dense and thick. And you're going to want to use your good drawing paper for this drawing. If you use newsprint, first of all, you need to draw big. So it needs to be your big 18 by 24 pad. And if you use newsprint, you're going to struggle because the charcoal will go on pretty well, but once you start to work the surface a lot, erasing, drawing back into it, you're going to overdo it with the newsprint. It's not designed to really hold up to that much of a beating, and you're going to wind up either ripping a hole through it, or it's going to make it real wrinkly, and you're just going to kind of saturate the paper in a way that you won't be able to correct very easily. So use the good paper. One thing I love about reflections is that as you start to pay attention to them, you can actually start to see what is being reflected in them. And so down here, you know, I've got this little bit of like triangle space of gray right here, and if you pay attention, that's actually the front of the table in the still life. So the little bit that's reflected, the front corner of the table is kind of bouncing back into the inside of this cylinder here, which is very cool. You notice that I'm still very much oversimplifying things. And I'll kind of decide where the front edge of my table is now. I think it'll be here. Pull out a little bit of light. Cast shadow. So I think what I'm going to mostly try and focus on in today's lesson is getting a really good solid 45 minutes or an hour start on this drawing. I expect you to probably draw a lot longer than that, probably something like 3 to 5 hours, because it's going to take you a while to figure this out. And if we were working together in class, we would draw on the same still life for 2 classes, which would be 4 hours. So start from that and work with that in mind. Like aim for 4 hours to get your drawing to the spot that it's going to take you. Some music back on. This is the L. Michaels Affair. This is their kind of lounge album of Wu-Tang Clan songs, which, if you're a Wu-Tang fan, you might like this. So as I start to get a little sharper with some of my decisions and my details, that's where I'm going to spend a little bit more time making sure that things are accurate. And I'm still going to work both sides of a line, right? So if I get something right or get something a little off, I'm going to go back in and touch it up on the other side of it. I've got an eraser in one hand, I'm using my fingers, and I'm using the charcoal, and I'm just bouncing back and forth between them. And not all the shading I'm doing with the charcoal is smearing. A lot of times I'm still just treating it just like we did last week with the pencil, where I'm using a bit more of a pencil grip and I'm just lightly scumbling back and forth across the surface of the paper to pull in like a little bit of a variant gray, something a little different than what I'm getting when I'm wiping with my fingers. Now, for your drawing, you are allowed to use the darker charcoals that you have, the Conte crayon, compressed charcoal if you'd like. Just wait until you get everything locked into your composition. Make sure that you're happy with how the composition is framing up before you do that. You can see that I'm still finding little things here and there. That was kind of a misshapen cylinder. So when I see something like that that's a little bit of a mistake, I don't mess around with leaving it. I just try and get rid of it, try and fix it. So hopefully you can start to see a little bit of how the reflection is working. It's getting there a little bit. Still pulling out some of the highlights. Have a lot of work to do yet on that, but I'm feeling pretty good about that as a starting point. Step back, a little view of the whole form. So one thing that's really crucial to teach yourself as an artist, as a creative, as a person in this world, is how to decide what done looks like. You're working under a deadline when you're in college, as you well know. You have a due date, and I have no doubt that you could work on your drawings forever. That you could work on them for 25 hours. And I know that some of us, myself included, have some neuroses, some anxieties that lead us to feel a little paralyzed by decision making and by trying to figure out when and how to finish something or even to start something. And this is what you do yourself this favor. Practice in times like this, and assignments like this, practice figuring that out. What is done look like to you in your drawing? For me, I am going to spend most of my time on what I called my focal point objects, on the reflective picture and the beaver skull. A lot of the rest of the drawing is very important to the composition, but not as important to where I want my viewer to look. And so what done is going to look like for me is whenever I'm happy, or at least don't hate, my focal point items, when I've got them to a spot to where I think that they're doing their job, that they're not looking dumb and distracting from the rest of the drawing, then I can start to consider the drawing closer to done. So I'm going to spend a lot more time on them than I ever will on the wall behind them, for instance, which I think is really cool. This wall back here it's got this great cool crack that runs through it. I will use the crack. But I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because it's just not as important to me in this drawing. What's important, what I expect that people will want to look at when they look at this drawing in the future, is the skull and the reflective thing in it, and so that's what I'm going to focus my attention on. And when I get them to a point to where they no longer bother me, then I can probably call the drawing close to done. And I might leave it, walk away for a little while, take a break, get a cup of coffee, come back and try to finish it. And that's kind of how I recommend that you work your drawings. When you get tired, and you will, take a break. But that means that you're going to need to know what your schedule is. And when do you have time? Like, you know, if you know that your best day to draw is Friday, you don't have to work that day, you don't have any other classes that day, and you've got all day to draw. That's great. Draw on Friday. But please do me the favor of starting your drawing before then. Because if you don't, what might happen is that you get to draw all day on Friday, but what if it's not going well? What if you get tired? You don't want to have all your eggs in the basket of finishing a project just with the single day that you have available for it. So difficult objects, complex objects like this skull. I'm not thinking of each mark that I make as a part of this skull. Okay, that sounds a little contradictory, I'm sure, but I'm thinking about them just as different shapes of grain. Okay, I'm looking from one shape to the next, and I'm just saying like, oh, this shape is a little bit more like a triangle. This shape's a little bit more like a sphere. This one's a little bit more like a cylinder. And I'm just kind of working them in that way as I go, and that's it. Then I can take a little bit more time kind of making things look the way that I need them to look as I go. So, for instance, this cheekbone here, this zygomatic arch, arches back this way and leaves a pretty dark shape underneath it, and that's what I'm following down in that eye socket as well to get some of my marks to fit in the right spot. Then there's a cluster of darkness where the mandible, where the back of the jawbone kicks in. I'm using that as well. Continuing to blur my eyes when I need to not get too bogged down in the detail. Letting my hand and I work together to do some of the heavy lifting. Letting the blockiness of the form help me out a little bit. I like to imagine that I'm kind of sculpting it in wood. What's more important than that it has all the lines in the exact right place is that it feels dimensional. That it feels like it has a top, a bottom, a side. That light strikes it and that it casts a shadow. If I get it to do those things, I'm usually pretty happy with the way that it looks in terms of detail and nameability. Like, oh, I can name that, it's a skull. Okay. Let's get a little darker in this background. One thing that I love about this bell jar is the way it warps anything that moves to the edge of it. So like you guys can probably see this cool little bend that the black cloth does into the surface of the jar as it wraps around. And I definitely want to include that in my drawing. So I'm going to probably overemphasize it a little bit, just so that I can kind of see what's, so that the viewer, since at the very top of the drawing, won't miss it. And so in order to overemphasize that, it means that I might lighten the wall a little bit more than actually is necessary. Create a little pop of contrast there. Now, this is an important lesson as well, that like, if I can see it, cool. If I can't see it but the drawing needs it, I still want to use it, okay? Another way of saying that is, there's an old adage, supposedly from the great storyteller Anasazi, who said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. Well, similarly, never let the truth get in the way of good art. If you need to move something around to make it make sense in your drawing, or to make the drawing cooler, by all means, do it. I'm going to grab that chamois, because it'll make a nice chamois cloth, make a nice lighter, smoothed tone than my eraser would. Now, as I wipe, it's going to get really dark, so I'm going to want to move to different spots of the chamois and go from there. You can see I can kind of make a little bit of a hazy atmosphere, which I love. It feels like I'm drawing the air. Like the room is kind of cloudy, smoky. And that can be very useful to me. Gives me a second to kind of darken inside the jar, kind of prove its existence again on the outside edge. And then I'm going to take my eraser and I'm going to just lighten up just a hair. And then you can probably see that there's a little bit of a soft reflection there at the top, and then that's where we get a little bit of highlight and then that really bold highlight. Now for that bold one, I'm going to grab a tougher eraser, my white. I'm going to try and work in a little bit more and try and track space. There we go, that's pretty good. And now I'm going to come back in with my vine charcoal and just work around that highlight just a little bit, clean it up really lightly. It's an important part that's missing in a lot of drawings that use smearing or stumping or smudging or whatever you want to call it, is a lot of times they're not reworked after the fact. It's like the smear is the last move that an artist does. And if you do that, you run the risk of it being a little imprecise compared to what you actually wanted. And so you want to, have a way, a tool to work back into there and give it a little bit of form, give it a little bit of light, or dark in this case, to give it a little bit extra contrast. All right, I'm feeling pretty good about this. Let's see, I've been drawing for about 30 minutes. Let me give it another 10, see where we're at, and then I'll very much look forward to hearing comments, questions in the future. Don't forget to email me as you work on this. I'm asking a lot. I'm asking you to basically teach yourself a difficult method by watching a couple videos. So get in there, have some fun with it, and if you run into snags, email me. Don't just think, well, I couldn't figure it out, so game over. After I get a lot of those really bold shapes, that's when I can go in and give some pretty nice detail by paying attention to where this mark or that mark needs to go. So noticing extra little subtleties in some of the planes, getting a little extra highlights by using a sharp side of the eraser, By the way, these erasers, these white Stedlers, you can cut them with your X-Acto knife that I had you buy, your utility knife, and get a sharp edge on one side. Be careful if you're using a knife, obviously. And you can use that sharp edge to work in a little extra brightness on a form where you need a little distinction, a little sharpness from one side of the form to from the light side to the dark side. You guys into this music? I couldn't. I was so sick of doing these demos in silence. I talk too much anyways, and it gets really bad when I've got nothing to listen to. If we were in class at Clark, we'd definitely be listening to music while we worked. For me, it's a kind of a must. So hopefully, it's a little experiment. Hopefully, it'll won't hurt the quality of the video too much. So one thing that I hope that you can tell by watching me draw is how long it takes to refine a drawing. Your initial knock-in, blocking everything in, is pretty quick, and things will look pretty good there. And the goal though is to push past that just a little bit, to keep working for it, so that you get the forms and shades and darknesses that you need. Those of you who like to draw the human figure, this is a really great method for that as well. Because for all the same reasons that I've been talking about today, it really lets you see the big picture first. It allows you to have a lot of variety and value and not be kind of dominated by the white of the paper, which gives you so much more flexibility in dealing with variations in skin tone, both light and dark skin tone. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there for today. One last thing before I go. I mentioned in our announcement for this week that it'd be a good idea for you to pick up some workable fixative. I just wanted to quickly show you what that is. This is a can of Krylon workable fixative, and you can buy this at any art supply store. It's a little spendy. It might be $9 or $10. But the purpose is so that when you're done with your drawing, it won't smear every time you move it. So in order to apply it, you got to spray it outside. Okay, it's like spray paint. It's bad for you. You don't want to breathe it in. You'll kill us all. So I'm not going to spray it in here because I'm inside. You take it outside, and then you spray a nice even coating from about 6 inches away, all the way across the drawing surface. Then turn your paper and do it again. Then turn your paper and do it again. You want to coat each of the kind of rounded forms of each of the bits of paper, and that way it'll be protected. And you do that last. Workable fixative means you can draw back on top of it, but you won't be able to erase anything out from it. And a lot of illustrators will actually use multiple stages of workable fixative in their drawing. So maybe they draw in yellow first, spray it, draw in red next, spray it, draw in black next, spray it, and then white highlights and spray it. And so each layer kind of locked in place. For you, you're probably only using 1 or 2 layers, so it should work just fine when you're done to spray it down that way. I think for me, I'll keep messing around with this drawing a little bit over the next hour and see if I can get it to a place of a little bit more refinement, and then I'll post a photo of it in our week 3 module on Canvas. So thank you so much for watching this recording, or if you were here live, for doing that. And let me know if you have any email questions. Don't forget, if it's about a drawing that you're in the process of working, take a photo of it. Don't try and explain it to me. Take a shot of it so we can see. I'll show you this at a little bit better angle real quick. That's a little bit better. Kind of see what I'm seeing. All right, it's looking pretty okay. Let me know if there's any questions you have, and thank you guys very much. Good luck this week. I'll get to your grades as soon as possible. Take care. Thanks a bunch.